Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Alan Maloney, who is a Jungian analyst and psychiatrist in private practice in San Francisco. He is an adjunct clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford School of Medicine, where he did his psychiatric residency, and co-founder and president at Cogent Medicine. He received his medical degree from Tufts University School of Medicine and did his residency in radiation oncology at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. He's a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, where he's currently an analyst member. And he's published extensively, including articles on Darwin and Jung in a New Psychiatry, and archetype theory, evolutionary psychology, and the Baldwin effect. Will you explain the Baldwin effect today?
No, not today.
Okay. Too much.
That's, if you give me another half an hour, maybe.
Okay. Very good. His lecture today is entitled Beyond the Night Sky, A Perspective on Science and Humanism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Alan Maloney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have a chance to speak with you all, and it's a privilege to participate in honoring Dr. Anthony Stevens. Dr. Stevens has made prolific contributions to the worlds of both depth psychology and evolutionary psychology. And while there are many contributions that Dr. Stevens has made, the one I'd like to draw attention to and elaborate today is his capacity to think about a range of disciplines that bear on human psychology in a rigorous and at the same time holistic fashion. Resisting the pole of polarizing academic disputes is harder than it may sound. Many very smart people get tripped up when thinking about how to reconcile distinct but convergent ideas. It is, I think, this ability to hold on to findings from different disciplines while refusing to violate the integrity of any of them that is, to me, the most appealing aspect of his work. And it is this commitment to suffer this tension in pursuit of a fuller understanding of human experience that has relevance not only for the theory of depth psychology, but also for therapeutic practice of analysis and the synthesis of different but convergent disciplines that bear on our understanding of human psychology. In this holistic approach, Dr. Stevens is in good company. We're here today at the C.G. Jung Foundation in New York, and we remember how Jung repeatedly advocated for the holding of opposites and avoiding false dichotomies, and to my mind, eschewing stylistic syncretism. Analytic psychology has distinguished itself as an approach to depth psychology that holds a full range of human experiences and expression as legitimate topics of psychological inquiry, and therefore is able to consider topics such as religion, symbolism, and art as manifestations of psyche rather than alien, defensive, or illusory. If we're determined enough to want to benefit from the power of scientific insight and also want to benefit and want to respect the integrity of subjective experience, we need this sort of holistic approach, and personally I think we should be that ambitious. As I've played with the question of what perspective or framework is most useful for the project of integrating the fullest range of results that bear on human nature, bear on the nature of human psychology, I often reflected on this Flammarion wood carving, sometimes called the atmosphere. I have a colorized version here to give a backdrop to my talk, as I've used it as a backdrop for my reflections. This image has helped me organize my thinking about this question. The image was known to Jung. It was discussed in Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth, where he commented on the juxtaposition of the material and the projected elements. In the image, at least two levels of experience are present simultaneously. It is an image of both the material world and the eternal dimension, which brings the whole into view. It's an image of bridging or straddling two different realities, which are nonetheless coincident and co-occurring. One of the insights this image helped me with is that while projection is an essential element in learning about the world, it can also create biases that need to be contended with. In relatively recent times, we have learned that the psychic reality of the heavens was initially projected onto the canvas of the sky. This projection of ourselves onto the sky made it familiar and comprehensible. In time, we withdrew that projection and we deepened our understanding of ourselves and became more psychological. In our contemporary era, we're now learning how our intellectual perspectives bias our understandings of objective scientific results, and in a preliminary fashion, we're actually learning more specifically how these biases operate. This is opening a new set of challenges for the world of psychology, and the cycle of analysis, separation, and integration continues. In the past 10 years or so, important intellectual support for this sort of robust, holistic approach has been developing. These developments have happened in two areas in particular. One is systems biology, and the other is decision theory. These disciplines suggest how we might examine the full range of results that bear on human psychology without falling prey to the atomizing effect of reductive science, and how we can move beyond emergence in integrating disparate results. Systems biology is a biology-based interdisciplinary field of study that focuses on complex interactions. It is consistent with reductive science and dependent upon the role of emergence. However, its focus is system-wide, holistic, and not bottoms-up. System biology posits a complex system as the appropriate framework for considering higher-order biological investigations. This allows not only for the observation of emergent phenomena, but for the generation of new hypotheses at a higher order of interaction, which can then be empirically tested. The essential feature that I want to draw attention to is that it does not limit the inquiry to the fundamental or even the emergent level. This approach to biology is the intellectual framework which has allowed for disciplines such as genomics and the other omics such as proteomics, epigenomics, and biomics to develop. I believe that bottom-up approach comes with biases that create serious limitations and pull consideration in the direction of reductive and emergent perspectives, and that a systems approach overcomes these limitations. So that's a bold statement. Why do I think that? Well, that brings up the discipline of decision theory. Decision theory is a field that was developed largely by Amos Tversky, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and Daniel Kahneman. They won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for their contributions to decision theory. Decision theory explores how certain types of cognitive biases operate. So it helps us understand that the perspective we bring to a question shapes what we consider. And that information that may appear incidental can actually anchor people's thinking and bias people's perceptions. So let me give a real-world example of this. As mentioned, I did some training in radiation oncology. I actually started doing radiation oncology before I switched into psychiatry. And when I was a resident in radiation oncology, it was very clear to me that how you spoke with patients about their survival had a profound effect on their mental states. My colleagues in radiation oncology weren't always so convinced that there was any difference between telling someone that they had a 90% chance of survival instead of telling them they had a 10% chance of mortality. This in some ways is understandable. They both describe the same objective odds. That said, for most people, they evoke very different reactions. These unconscious effects are not just emotional. Decision theory has shown they bias cognition as well. So why does all this matter? Well, it matters because we approach the integration of convergent fields with an awareness of our biases. If we don't approach it with an awareness of our biases, we leave our projections unexamined, and we put at risk a more integrated model of psychology. We end up with either atomized perspectives or a perspective that creates false choices, which can have very real consequences. This can happen even for some very smart people. And my example of that is some of the work contributed by Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionary biologist who became a public intellectual and a commentator on the emerging thoughts around science and humanism. In time, he became a strong critic of evolutionary psychology. He ridiculed it as a collection of just-so stories that were merely charming and had no more explanatory power than some other made-up story. He at the same time was also a defender of the validity of religion and religious experience. But he held that science and religion were what he called non-overlapping magisteria. That's a mouthful. What he meant by that was that they were independent traditions and they did not overlap. There was no overlap between the two of them. So years ago, I was at an HBES meeting. HBES was the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meeting. where Gould presented an early version of this idea and generated a very strong reaction. He was challenged, critiqued, accused of being intellectually dishonest, and even booed. I was sympathetic to his perspective because I too value the integrity of subjectivity, and I admired his willingness to take a public position so at odds with the assembled group. It struck me as personally courageous. In time, though, I began to realize the broader implications of his position. While he appealed to me as an apologist for subjectivity, he was asserting that religion and science had no common ground and no overlap. This seemed odd to me because in my mind, religion and religious features are pretty clearly part of psyche, and as such can be considered in an integrated fashion. It seemed to me that Gould was basically proposing a split as the price we needed to pay to preserve the sanctity of individual experience. This came to strike me as a sort of a desperate stance, that we perpetuate a split and leave unintegrated certain aspects of human experience in order to protect religion and religious experience. This is not only psychologically problematic, I think it's an intellectual dead end. As I considered Gould's argument in this ongoing debate, it occurred to me that his criticism of just so stories was too clever by half. In science, hypotheses are generated within a framework which can then be tested. Evolutionary psychology often uses an adaptionist framework. Something like, what is the adaptive value of this trait, gene, or behavior? However, evolutionary psychology doesn't end there. It generates ideas and then tests them. It may use an explanatory framework to generate novel ideas, but it employs scientific techniques to confirm or refute them. Gould's appeal to split what type of experience can be considered scientific and what types are to be considered religious is problematic. There's been a robust criticism of his idea of non-overlapping magisteria, but to my mind it's principally come from the community of skeptics and not the community of humanists. For example, Susan Jacoby, who's the director of the Center for Inquiry here in New York City, criticized the validity of the non-overlapping magisteria idea with the observation that science can determine whether a particular received religious belief increases or decreases human suffering. Her position is that science therefore has the moral standing to address that belief. And while the community of humanists may feel, as I initially did, comforted by the apparent advocacy of subjectivity in the concept of non-overlapping magisteria, it strikes me now as a bad bargain. I don't think that we should be so insecure about the integrity or sanctity of subjective experience that we would half blind ourselves in an effort to protect it. Subjectivity, religion, and religious experience are not dependent on science for validity. They are subjective realms. But even when examined in the light of science, they hold their own. Let me give an example. Right before I left San Francisco to come here to New York for this meeting, I did a brief Medline search for clinical trials that used mindfulness as a clinical intervention. Medline is the National Library of Medicine's 14 million citation database of medical scientific literature. Mindfulness is a tenet of Buddhism, which is, of course, a religion. When I did this search, there were 300 clinical trials reported that report results empirically examining the effect of mindfulness. The idea that we should not integrate the wisdom and experience of religion in our thinking about psychology simply doesn't make sense. When there is a psychological dimension to religion, it can be included in and inform scientific study. The idea that we have to choose between scientific rigor and the sanctity of subjectivity is an offer I think we should simply refuse. I think the alternate perspective that we can is that we can productively employ is the systems approach, something akin to systems biology. I've spent some time pointing out the risk of not using this approach. Now let me give you an example that demonstrates its value and I think shows how it allows for the exploration of scientifically testable ideas that would not be apparent from a reductionist nor even an emergent perspective. So to do this, I'm going to use the example of the scientific study of the serotonin reuptake gene. Everybody knows about serotonin and the serotonin reuptake protein. Genes, as you all know, are stretches of DNA that code for a particular protein. We get two copies of most genes. One is from mother and one from father. Some genes have only one form. Some have variations called alleles. This particular gene has two versions. One is a short version, usually called S, and the other version is a long version called L. So there are two versions of the gene. You can have you can have two short versions of the gene, and you then would have short from both mother and father. You can have a short and long version of the gene from mother and father, or from father and mother. And you can have the version with two copies of the long version of the gene. Some scientists are interested in understanding the effect of genes and the effect they produce in organisms during the course of life. Because a particular gene can produce two functioning versions of the same serotonin transporter protein, scientists were curious to know if the long or short version was associated with risks for depression, anxiety, or neuroticism, which is basically a good, sound, reductive scientific question. The problem was that as scientists began to try to understand this, for about a decade, they couldn't get a handle on whether the short version put individuals at risk for things like depression. Some studies showed that the S allele, the short version of the gene, was associated with higher rates of things like depression. Some scientists began to think of the S version of this gene as something akin to a depression gene. Pretty reductive. If you had an S allele, you were a little bit of a sitting duck. However, other studies, which were just as methodologically rigorous, failed to find any link between having the S allele and things like depression. In time, researchers began thinking that maybe the effect of the gene wasn't so straightforward. Maybe its contribution to things like depression might be dependent upon certain life experiences, perhaps negative life experiences. This is an emergent perspective on the gene effect. Nature and nurture interact to produce a predictable outcome. Well, sure enough, when researchers began to look at the interaction of the gene variations and the environment, they found that people who had the S allele and negative life experiences had higher rates of things like depression. So by looking at this question from an emergent perspective, scientists were able to make sense of their earlier findings. They began to think of the S allele as a vulnerability factor. If you had this version of the gene, you were at risk for things like depression. At this point, you sort of come to the end of the road of what you can do with reductive or emergent thinking. Okay? It's about as far as you can go. Fortunately, scientists don't actually think this way and don't typically work this way. They're beginning to argue less and less this way. What happened was that some scientists began to ask the question at sort of the system level, okay? Which is, what role does the short version of the gene play in individuals and in populations? It's maybe just a kind of just so story, as Stephen Gould might say, but an interesting one, and it turns out a testable one. Perhaps one of the possibilities could be that the short version of the gene had some adaptive psychological potential, and that symptoms that appear pathological may actually serve some other purpose, either in the individual or the population at large. Well, as commonsensible as that seems, it is outside the scope of the reductionist science. It is even outside the scope of emergence to develop such a hypothesis. Because even though it relies on emergence, it is informed by the features and qualities of the system as a whole, rather than the component parts that produce the emergence. It is very much consistent with a systems approach, an adaptivist approach, or a homeostatic approach to psychology. Well, the great thing about science is that it does move forward. So sure enough, in 2012, a paper was published in that celebrated humanist journal, Genes, Brain, and Behavior. The authors looked at the short and long version of the genes and the effect of both negative and positive life experiences. They specifically had an eye to understand what the purpose of the S version might be from sort of an adaptionist perspective. And what they found was really interesting and, to my mind, delightful and informative. Subjects with the S allele and negative life events were vulnerable to depression, and subjects with the L allele were less affected by negative life events. Subjects with the L allele were, in some ways, more resilient. Subjects with the S allele, who reported both positive and negative life events, interestingly reported that their positive life events were more salient in their experience. And subjects who had the S version, the short version, who had a preponderance of positive life events, were much happier and satisfied in their lives than those who had the L version and had positive life events. So these results change one's thinking about the S allele. It's not a depression gene, as perhaps seen from the reductive perspective. It's not a vulnerability factor, as seen perhaps from the emergent perspective. It's a plasticity factor, as seen from this more holistic perspective. This perspective accounts for all the early results. It also removes the element of genetic misfortune. It explains not just the gene, but how we might think about this gene, and how genes may have an effect on subjective experience and behavior, not only as potential deficits, but as components in a complex system. This holistic system, this holistic perspective, is a framework which allows for the integration of findings from a variety of related disciplines. It is consistent with reductive and emergent science, and it respects the integrity of individual experience. A few weeks ago, President Obama announced plans for the Brain Initiative project to map the connections of the human brain, what some people call a neural connectome. What has been a growing stream of scientific results that bear on psychology will in time become a torrent. The question of how to integrate these findings with perspectives that respect and dignify human agency and subjectivity becomes an even more pressing question. So in closing, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Stevens' work as being done in the spirit, which is both an accomplishment and an important contribution to our understanding of psychology. Thank you.
Could you say again where that image comes from?
It's from a collection of wood carvings. The publisher was a fellow by the name of Flammarion, and it's a woodcut that was probably done in the 18th century. It looks a little older than that, but it's probably more recent.
And where would one find it?
You can find it easily on the internet if you type in atmosphere, Flammarion. And you'll find it in Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth, where Jung comments on it in the collection of images.
You can find it in our
Okay.
Yeah,
How
there
do
you go, of
spell
course.
Flammarion, F-L-A-M-E-R-I-A-N?
F-L-M, exactly right. Yeah.
If you look at Google Images, you'll get about 38.
Yes.
Do you have an explanation of why the scientific, that aspect of the scientific community represented by Gould is so resistant to this holistic approach?
I think it really comes down to what's a very understandable sense of urgency that some of these people, Gould I think in particular, really wanted to preserve the integrity and sort of protect religion and religious experience from more skeptical or cynical critics in the scientific community. And some people are very harsh in their criticism of things like subjective experience, religious experience, Dawkins, I think, as an example. But there's a fellow by the name of Franz der Waal who does a lot of ethological and evolutionary psychology research, and he likens some of the criticism of skeptics of religion to people standing outside a movie theater shouting that Leonardo DiCaprio was not really on the Titanic. And that it really sort of lacks a perspective and an understanding about the quality of the experience. And so I think there's a sense that there has to be sort of a devil's bargain. That in order to protect and advocate for subjectivity, you have to create this false firewall. But I think it really does damage. It creates a great deal of confusion. And I think it limits our understanding and our approach. I've had the unsatisfying experience of speaking with people, other analysts, about things like genetic effects in human biology and the human brain. And I've been asked to declare whether I believe that archetypes are metaphysical or if they're biological. I don't think that question makes any sense. you can look at nature and nurture. You can look specifically at nature, you can look specifically at nurture. But basically you're talking about an interaction. And any perspective which doesn't respect the fact that it's an interaction is, to my mind, bizarre. So I think it's driven by things other than a particular scientific need. I think it's more a personal need to advocate for something worth defending. But it's done in a way which is unnecessary.
It's a very interesting response because I wouldn't have expected it. I would have thought that you would have talked about their need to, their fear that the scientific method would be compromised somehow.
That may be true. That may be true for some people, but I think for Gould talked very passionately about his respect for religion. So I think in his case particularly, it was something a little bit different.
Yeah, I don't see where having respect for something gives it a free pass. And I kind of agree with what I would think our earlier speaker talked about, which would be that we are not this empty slate. There is something there to begin with, whether it's instinct or something else. And so I think you've asked a different question.
I'm not sure if I understand yours. Nothing I've said posits a blank slate. I'm not a fan of tabula rasa models of the mind.
Well, but if you're taking Gould's side, to say that he has to protect religion out of respect for religion, I don't see that as a scientific reason.
I agree with you. I agree with you entirely. And that's why I think Gould's perspective was, an intellectual dead end. It's wrong-headed. So Gould is, for me, sort of a negative example of how people can get off track. Okay. So I hope I was clear about that, but if I wasn't, let me be clear. I think this is what I've loved so much about Dr. Stevens' work, is he's not fallen prey to this kind of either-or thinking. And I think that people like Gould have unfortunately done that. And there are other people in analytical psychology that fall prey to that. And they tend to come more on the subjective side and be a little bit more critical of the limitations of science. But I really think there's a broad and robust middle ground that brings into perspective, brings into focus a much more comprehensive view of the psyche.
The image is sometimes called an unus mundus image, the one world
Mm-hmm.
image, and that's uniting the two perspectives.
Right.
This may be a little off the point, but Jung had relatively little to say about Darwin. I think 3 or 4 references in the collected works. And to my way of thinking, Darwin was a pretty hardcore, reductive thinking kind of scientist. Caused great problems, some problems in his marriage with his very traditionally religious wife. Now Jung likes to think of himself as both a scientist and a mystic, someone with spiritual outlooks, perspectives, and so forth. And I think that's where he's gotten in trouble, in the public mind at least, the fact that he carries both mantles, the scientist and the spiritual person. I think the marriage, if it's possible, of science and spirituality, religion, or whether it's better to keep them totally separate, it's an ongoing question, isn't it?
I don't think so, and let me be clear why I don't think it's an ongoing question. A lot of this is a problem with language. Okay, if by religion you mean the facts of received religious belief, yes, they are different disciplines. So if you're referring specifically to metaphysics, it is exactly beyond physics. Okay, But when you're talking about religious experience that occurs in one of us, or in all of us, or in every single one of us, okay, then you're talking about something which absolutely and positively overlaps with psychology. And that's where the idea of non-overlapping magisteria is just wrong-headed. So I think what's happened is that a lot of science that had to take place early on in understanding things like genes was by its nature reductive. Darwin, I think, was a reductive thinker, but I think it's also interesting to note he didn't publish Origin of the Species until he had to. Okay, so there was something that kept him from pulling that trigger for many years. And we can speculate what that is. My own speculation has maybe to do with his marriage, but I think more to do with his own conflict about what he saw as being potentially very disruptive to religion. He saw religion as a positive force. So my contention is we don't have to leave these fields, when they overlap, separate. That in fact, when they overlap, it is legitimate to look at them from both perspectives, and that by doing so, we get a more stereoscopic, a more 3D view of what it is that we're contemplating, and we can actually see the world in a more holistic fashion.
Why did Darwin feel he had to publish it?
Because he was right, and he wanted to. I'm sorry. What was it? What was approximate trigger? It was who was about to publish.
Wallace.
Wallace, thank you very much. Right. So one of his contemporaries who was working on the same idea was about to pull the trigger, and as we all know, the important thing is to be published first.
And by the way, Darwin had a dream just before he published that he would be hung.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that doesn't reveal some, yeah, okay, right.
I just want to say that around 1995 at MIT, I heard Gould give a, this is not significant, I just want to mention it, that at MIT he gave a lecture about the completing Darwin's work on the God hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it was to bring Darwin's work to a conclusion, which was to reject it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I want to say. I want to say something else. So you could regard the human being as having, as functioning as a dynamic system,
Yes.
within which there are at least two layers of systems that are interacting. One is genetic, and one is psychic.
Yeah. I'd actually be a little more ambitious than that. There's a fellow at Stanford by the name of Richard Shepard. Richard Shepard has done some work that's gotten a lot of criticism about the way in which recurrent features of the environment are reflected in the adapted design of the organism. Okay, and people have rebutted that for all kinds of reasons, but I think the rebuttals are actually, I was joking before lunch today that in academics the point is not to be right, it's to make the other person wrong. And so people have managed to find faults with the way in which Shepard has argued this, but I'd point out that there are many features of our body that reflect the regularities of our world. And I think the most easily accessible is probably circadian rhythms. So there is a master circadian rhythm, if you will, in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a little spot above where the optic nerves crisscross in your head. But there are actually circadian rhythms in organs as well, independent of the suprachiasmatic nucleus.
But also in the psyche.
What I'm saying is that psyche and soma are two sides of the same thing. Okay, that so one of the things that is assumed about a circadian rhythm is that it is both self-regulating, okay, but also open to environmental input. Okay, so that what we think of as being sort of the barriers inside world, outside world, are probably not as crisp as they might appear. There's a blurring, and not just interpersonally through things like mirror neurons, which you mentioned earlier, but I think in our wider environment, and that environment includes both the terrestrial environment, but also a social environment. And I think that's meaningful. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I don't think that's something which should be left out.
If it's in a social environment, then you're interacting with other integrated genetic and psychic systems. So it's not really, and I just saw a painting over at this museum, this place over there called Delirium Vegetal by Henri Masson. And you might think of the psychic rhythms also of the vegetable world, you know, integrated with their own genetics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely, and you know the psychic rhythms of you know the vegetative mysteries of life and death, and you know that this is something that comes up with thinking about death and dreams sometimes. Is that you know death psychologically doesn't mean the end of things. Okay, we don't know for sure. There's very scant reliable evidence of what happens after you die. Okay, but what we do know is that death is not the end psychologically. You know, the king is dead, long live the king. The winter comes, spring, the fall, the winter, spring comes. Life begins again and again and again. And it's the ability, I think, to respect the depth with which we're connected to the rest of the world that I think is, for me, one of the most compelling aspects of archetype theory.
Can you name specifically what areas of work are being done in this holistic mode? Any specific areas that you're aware of?
Yeah, in systems biology?
Yeah, systems
Oh, well,
biology.
systems biology is what gave us things like genomics and epigenomics, biomics. We're looking at what we'll probably call the neural connectome. So an example would be, well, I cited an example about thinking about genes and how to think about the specific gene. But what we've come to learn is that we're affected by multiple levels simultaneously in ways that are consequential. So for example, we all learned years ago that you know, a gene is what produces a protein, which produces a structure, which influences behavior. Well, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that. That a lot of the genes that we have are regulatory genes, and so they operate on sort of a meta level, if you will. It turns out that experience has an effect on the expressive tags on those genes, if you will. So we all learned that, you know, the idea was just wrong-headed, that a giraffe, Linnaeus might think, you know, evolved because it stretched more and more, and each generation the neck got longer. Well, giraffes didn't evolve that way, but it turns out that if you look at the epigenomic labeling of genes that affect the human nervous system, okay, and there's some collection of genes we know that are relevant to the human nervous system. If you look at the retention of the labeling of those genes, okay, from one generation to the next, it's incredibly high. It's 30%. Okay, so what that means is that it's not just our experience which can affect our functioning of our genes, but it's actually our parental experience that can affect the function of the genes, as well as the genes, as well as our personal experience. So we're not looking at one or two levels. We're looking at multiple levels, and we can't think about that using sort of reductive tools or even emergent tools. Okay, you have to think about it in a systems-wide fashion. So systems biology is new. It's only, I think Stanford was one of the first places to open a systems biology center, and it's only, I think, 10 years old. And there aren't that many in the country, but it's sort of an emerging paradigm in the biological sciences. I don't think I've heard it yet in the psychological sciences, but my guess would be that you'll see more and more of that in years to come. I certainly hope so.
Could you help explain the relationship between archetypes and natural selection?
I'm not sure that I can. So the short answer is no, but the on-the-spot answer is I'll try to wing it. You know, I don't. How do I say this? I think that there are probably some archetypal dimensions that are more explicitly biologically based. For example, let's say whatever codes for the protein responsible for the master circadian rhythm in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, okay? And that if you had an organism that had a wrong length circadian rhythm, 40 hours, it might be tired when things are trying to eat it, and it probably would not survive to propagate its genes in subsequent generations. If you had a version of that gene that was not open to environmental inputs, and there was some seasonality, it lived at a higher or lower latitude, it might also not be plastic enough, and it might not be responsive and contingent enough to actually confer an adaptive advantage. So that one might get not passed on. But I think when we talk about archetypes, we're not talking about a single thing, we're talking about a category of things. So I think some are probably more, what did Jung say, psychoid, and some are more psychological, even if they all have biological bases to them.
That leads to the idea that natural selection is an archetypal idea.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting it. And that's something which happens in the natural environment, okay? That's something which precedes, and that's sort of a version of the reality of psyche, which is maybe eternal. Okay, thank you very much.